Greetings. We continue our post-Easter series, if you're seeing this video then, looking at John chapters 20 and 21. And today we're in the first half of John 21, that is verses 1 to 14. I know that some people say that John 21 is a later add-on to the Gospel written by someone other than the author of the Gospel. Many of the people who say that dispute or deny that John, the beloved disciple, John, one of the 12, John, the brother of James, was the author of the Gospel that bears his name. And sometimes it seems that people are more keen to deny claimed authorship than they are to study the text. I'm not wishing to engage particularly on the question of authorship. It does seem to me that within the core of John's Gospel, the eyewitness evidence and the whole feel of it reads like John, the disciple, as we know him from elsewhere. And both the first half of chapter 1 and this chapter 21, which are often described as the prologue and the epilogue, seem to me to fit perfectly well. The author has done what many a modern author will do, of writing a passage or a book or an essay or something and giving it a prologue and an epilogue. They don't have to have been written at different times at all. They might have been, but even if they were, there's no need for them to have been written by someone different. There are a lot of features in common. There is a bit of language, a bit of vocabulary in John 21 that doesn't occur elsewhere in the Gospel, but there are one or two events described that don't occur elsewhere in the Gospel, such as Simon Peter being naked. That word, which could mean stark naked, it could mean just in undergarments, but that word doesn't appear elsewhere in the Gospel. That doesn't prove that this chapter doesn't belong with the Gospel. It's just a description that isn't very common in the Gospel, and so on with a few other words. I'm very content that this is part of the Gospel. It makes sense. It adds to John his testimony about himself, as we'll see in the next study, but also it's his testimony about Jesus. There's also in this wonderful, wonderful chapter scope for symbolism, scope for symbolic numbers, scope for all sorts of games we could play, and some who've commented on this chapter, written, preached, and so on, have come up with all sorts of fanciful ideas. We're not going to be worried about those. Yes, it is described that there were 7 disciples gathered there by the Sea of Tiberias, what we sometimes call Lake Galilee. Yeah, there were 7 of them, and 5 are named, 2 are unnamed. That you can say, if you want, 7 as a symbolic perfect number, etc., etc. And John does indeed describe 7 great miracles and 7 I am sayings of Jesus, but he doesn't make a big deal of the 7 significance. I don't think we need to either. Similarly, we find in this story 153 fish, and you would be astounded at the number of different meanings that you can apply to 153. If you're a keen mathematician, it's got all sorts of connections with 17 as a number, but significance of 17, well, you can go on and find meanings. Hebrew and Greek letters are often used with numeric meanings. They didn't have separate numbers, so letters could mean a number. And you can play games by adding up the number of the letters in different names or ideas to come to 153. John doesn't tell us to do that. He just says 153 fish. Take it at face value. It's a lot of fish. Some people say this is the same story, the miraculous fish, as the miraculous catch of fish in Luke chapter 5. I find that difficult to believe, not least because this is very much described as after the resurrection. Luke 5 certainly wasn't. In Luke 5, we've got lots of fish. We don't know the number, but we know that the nets are broken. Here, the net isn't broken, not even torn. The number is given because someone counted them. They're large fish, 153. One of the ancient writers, normally reliable but should have known better, said there are 153 fish because there are 153 species of fish in the known world, and it represented the whole gathering of all the nations, all the races to follow Jesus. Well, even in his day, there were more than 153 species of fish known. It's just fanciful game playing. It's an astonishing enough miracle without trying to work out deep meaning. So we're not going to look for deep meaning in the number 7. We're not going to look for deep meaning in the number 153. Where we might find a bit of meaning, and I wouldn't be surprised at this because it's one of John's favorite bits of symbolism right through the book, is in verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, etc. And the miracle, a number of miracles in this story, I think, but a miracle, a big one, is about to happen. Night and day, symbolizing darkness and light, symbolizing ignorance, people without God, light symbolizing God's revelation, God's word, God's presence, God's blessing. Night symbolizing human attempts to live and do without God. Day symbolizing God with us. I'm sure that is there and is part of the meaning. I'm not saying he made up the night and daylight stuff. Jesus gives them breakfast on the shore in the morning. They have been fishing at night. Night was a common time for them to fish, particularly in the warmer weather. It gets very hot around there in the summer. This would have been, if it's a little while after the resurrection, we're not sure exactly when, but resurrection almost certainly mid-April. We're talking late April or May, when it really does get hot around Lake Galilee. And when it's hot during the day, the fish like to go deep. They don't want hot water, and the surface layers are quite warm. Go deeper, and the temperature stays much the same through the year. And it's known, and fishing in Galilee, particularly in the summer, is largely nighttime, because that's when the fish come nearer the surface. These aren't modern type trawlers, and indeed those are still not wanted in places like Galilee. They are fairly shallow nets, so they're looking for large shoals of fish near the surface, ideally, and that's something that happens at night in the warmer weather. So yeah, it was a nighttime fishing. That's not made up, and it's breakfast time meeting on the shore. That's not made up. But the way John writes his gospel again and again, night, day symbolize darkness and light. It's day when Jesus is with you. It's night when you live without God, symbolically. Of course, God is with us at night as well as in the day. But using the symbolism of light and darkness, night and day, which John does ever so often, I'm sure that's part of what's going on here. Simon Peter and his gang go fishing back to their regular trade, at least for some of them. And they, even though the resurrection has happened and they've met the risen Lord, they seem to be back to life without him. Jesus isn't invoked in their fishing. They think they can do their normal stuff without Jesus. And John is wanting to tell us that even for the normal things of life, your normal trade, what you do, what you're good at, you're foolish if you keep God out of that or forget that God is part of it. And if you want to involve God and know that he's involved in your daily work, activities, leisure, whatever, then those things are richer and more blessed. And that's always been part of the Christian message. The sky is a deeper blue and the earth is a richer green when we see through the eyes that know Jesus to be alive. That's part of what's going on here. Well, this is described as the third time that Jesus appears to the disciples. That's verse 14. And yes, that's all the disciples together. Of course, there are individual appearances to one or the other. But we've got in John's Gospel the first appearance on the morning of Easter Day in the upper room, and the second appearance, first appearance in the evening of Easter Day in the upper room, second appearance a week later when Thomas is with them, and this is the third one. A little bit later, we don't know exactly when. Obviously, they've taken the time and travelled up to Nazareth, which would be 3 days walk normally, or travelled up to Galilee, which is 3 days walk-ish from Jerusalem. They've gone out fishing. A list of 7 of them. Interestingly, John names people when he wants to and not when not needed. We've got Simon, we've got Thomas. He's there, he's back with the disciples. Just a little reminder, he wasn't believing at first, now he is, now he's with the others. It's a good sign. Nathaniel of Cana in Galilee, mentioned in chapter 1, not mentioned since. He's back. He's with them very much, and we're told his hometown as well. The sons of Zebedee, which is John and his brother James, who was to become the first martyr not so long afterwards, first of the disciples of the apostles to be martyred. And 2 others unnamed for the moment. Well, unnamed, it doesn't matter. You could say they've made the number up to 7, but 2 others of the disciples are there. And they go fishing. It's not rod and line, obviously. It's not little recreational fish. This is their trade. And they have a boat and boats between them, but they go out in one boat at night and catch nothing. But they are professional fishermen. At least Simon is, and James and John are. Others may or may not have been, but you've got some who know what they're doing as regards fishing in that boat, and they catch nothing. And just after daybreak, verse 4, Jesus stands on the beach. And we're told a bit further down, it's 100 yards or so off. And he calls out to them. They didn't know it was Jesus. Well, just after daybreak, and 100 yards away, there's no significance in not knowing that it's Jesus at that point, at that distance, and in the early light of dawn. Children, you have no fish, have you? No. Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find some. And people talk about the significance of the right side of the boat. I think the significance of it is that their net was currently on the left side of the boat, and he said, swap over to the other side. There's no significance in the right side, I don't think, of in some parts of the ancient world, right meaning good or safe, and left meaning dodgy. Latin for left is sinister, from which we get sinister. There's no concept in Judaism of left being bad and right being good. He's not doing that. If there was a superstition that right was good, they'd have the net on the right-hand side anyway, I suspect. No, he says, just put your net on the other side. So they did, and they can't haul it in because of so many fish. And John, who's the one who thinks quickly, gets there quickly, says, it is the Lord. And Peter, who's the one who acts quickly, jumps in the water to get ashore. He puts a few more clothes on, or wording could mean a couple of different things. He may just be wearing an outer cloak, and he ties it up around him so his legs are free to swim or to wade through the water. It may be that he was just stripped down to loincloth and he puts his outer clothes on to go and meet the Lord. He's going to get them wet, but it's a warm place and the sun is beginning to shine. He jumps into the lake. The other disciples, here's a bit of eyewitness testimony from one who stayed in the boat. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they weren't far from the land, only 100 yards off. The net was so heavy they couldn't lift it into the boat as they normally would have done. They bring the boat and they drag the net behind them, and still it's not torn. And they get towards shore. When they'd gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire with fish on it and bread. It's a singular word for fish. It could have been a big fish, or it could just have been Jesus cooking his own breakfast. It's a strange old picture, but he says, bring some of the fish you've caught. There isn't enough fish on there for all of them. Maybe there's enough bread for starters for their breakfast. Bring some of the fish. So Simon went aboard and hauled the net ashore. Strong man, possibly with help, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus says, come and have breakfast. And none dared ask, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, John isn't here making a point that Luke makes on another resurrection appearance when they're indoors. and Luke and says, and the risen Jesus says, "Have you got anything to eat?" And they give him some fish, and he eats it. One of the evidences that he is bodily risen from the dead, not a ghost, is that he eats with them. And in Luke's account, a different story, Luke describes Jesus eating fish with the disciples. Here, it doesn't say Jesus is eating the fish. John isn't using the fish in that way in the story. Whether Jesus ate with them isn't quite clear, though it says he came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. Taking the bread, it's just an interesting little phrase. You'd normally say Jesus gave them the bread and he gave them the fish. When it was cooked, he served it out to them. He continues as a servant, as not so long before he'd served them by washing their feet in the upper room. Here he's serving them by serving the meal out to them. Jesus, even the risen Jesus, is servant of his disciples. It's very remarkable, but that's the story. In many other religions and in many misunderstandings of Christianity, Jesus is there to be served. Well, worship can mean serve. He's there to be worshipped. And of course, our calling as Christians is to serve him, but something different here. He is still the one who serves us. But he took the bread and gave it to them, and the same with the fish. Now, it doesn't say he ate any himself. It doesn't say he didn't. That's not John's point. I think there's something about the symbolic taking of the bread in particular, also with the fish. And that does bring us back to the Last Supper again. This isn't a fully sacramental meal. There isn't wine involved, and he doesn't talk about eating his flesh or anything like that, as in John chapter 6. But there's something going on. There's a little bit of ritual here. He takes the bread. Doesn't even say he broke it, but there's something there, something very special. He took that bread and gave it to them. Jesus gives what he has taken. It doesn't even say that he took the bread and blessed it. I think we might assume that quite reasonably. But this isn't just Jesus giving them a bit of bread. It's Jesus taking the bread, making it his own, owning it. They're not just receiving it, they're receiving the bread from Jesus. I think there's something special there in all this, and the same with the fish. This is the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. There's something very wonderful here in all sorts of ways. Come and have breakfast, such an evocative word. There's also the fire, the charcoal fire with fish on it and bread. It's a picture, a very, very vivid picture. This is an eyewitness account. It's not a made-up story full of symbolism at every point. I think there are one or two bits where I can't help seeing symbolism in the night and the day contrast, and in the taking and giving bread. I think for me, trying to avoid symbolism, those things are just starkly there. but I'm not wanting to find it in 7 disciples or 153 fish, or wherever else you might look for it in a charcoal fire or the significance of breakfast. What I'm seeing here is just a lovely, delightful story, an eyewitness account, a true story, something that really happened. And Jesus is appearing to them in their environment. For Peter and James and John, it's in their workplace. Jesus is appearing to them in their place. He he's born in Bethlehem in the south, refugee in Egypt as a young child, and then back to Nazareth in the territory of Galilee, but not near the lake, where he grew up. And then he moves to Capernaum to have as his base, though when he's not in the south of the country, in and around Jerusalem. And he calls his disciples largely, almost entirely, from the area around the Sea of Tiberias, Lake Galilee. And that's their place. It's his sort of adopted home, roughly aged 30 to 33, though he was on the road a fair bit, but he made Capernaum his home, Capernaum on the lakeside, on the northern edge of the lake. One of the main fishing centres. But these people, particularly Simon Peter and James and John, they are people of the lake. They are fishermen. It's their patch. They come from the villages around Capernaum, the fishing centre, and they live in Capernaum very often. Nathaniel from Cana, a bit further up in the hills, not too far from Nazareth. Nathaniel is there with them. They've obviously made their base post-resurrection back in the North Country round Lake Galilee. They're back to their home. They've seen the action in Jerusalem, and Jesus in Jerusalem has died for their sins and risen as the first fruits of resurrection life for all of us. Jesus in Jerusalem has done the acts of salvation. Jesus in Jerusalem is arrested and prays in the Garden of Gethsemane and goes through those dreadful mock trials and his torture. And in Jerusalem, Peter denies Jesus, and in Jerusalem, Jesus dies and is raised from the dead. Jerusalem is the earthly focus of our salvation and theirs, but Galilee is their home, and it's their workplace, and Jesus appears there. Of course, he appeared first in Jerusalem because that's where he rose. But Jerusalem isn't the focus. The focus of Jesus' action is where his people are. And they've quite naturally, in their confusion of beginnings of belief, he's risen from the dead. What on earth does this mean? But he's not around every day. It's not the same as before the resurrection. What are we going to do? We'll go home. And in fact, in one of the other Gospels, we read, "Go to Galilee. Go to Galilee and meet me there." And that's what they do. Natural thing. You've been through an astonishing 3 years. You still can't make head or tail really of it. It's turned out terribly badly, and then oh no, it's rather good. But still, what does it mean? What are we going to do now? let's go home. Let's go back to what we know and perhaps try and make sense of it, perhaps just carry on our lives. And so Jesus appears where they are. We don't need to be looking for Jesus in particular places. I say, as someone who loves leading pilgrimages to the Holy Land, but you don't need to go to Jerusalem or even to Galilee to find Jesus, because he came to find them where they were, as he wants to find you and be with you where you are. Amen.